Today, I'm thrilled to be speaking with Heydon Pickering, a renowned accessibility advocate, author, editor, and all-round front-end development and inclusive design guru. Heydon has significantly contributed to the field of digital accessibility through his work on inclusive components. He's written courses and books that have influenced interface design and consulted with companies such as the BBC, Spotify, the Wellcome Trust, and Springer Nature, to name a few. He's extremely well renowned, has given many thought-provoking talks internationally over the years, has remained dedicated to creating more inclusive and accessible products and services. Heydon also has his own YouTube channel and site where he posts amazing, brutally honest videos dialing into web technologies, and I'm hoping for a bit more of that straight talking in today's episode. So welcome to the podcast, Heydon.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, and thanks for the very nice intro.
Oh,
Um,
you're more than
yeah.
welcome.
um, yeah. Where should we start?
Well, I guess I should start by just mentioning that the video for this, if you're watching on YouTube, is in black and white, and the branding will
Right.
be as well. Which I would say is a bit of a style choice of yours in a lot of your own content, Heydon. So would you mind
Yeah.
perhaps quickly just sort of explaining that choice for your
Yes,
own
of
content?
course. Yeah, it comes from. I suppose it comes from a place of laziness, apart from anything else. I, I, I like things to be pared down, and I liked working um, with within limitations, I suppose. And just working with black and white means that there's only so many variables that I have to think of. And so that's partly it. It's also that I actually find interfaces with a lot of colors kind of overwhelming. I have like a what do you call it? A sensory processing to some extent, but mostly a what's the term for um see, now I can't think of it, which is probably related to the issue. Um, Executive functioning, that's what it
Oh,
is.
yes, yeah.
So I'm easily overwhelmed. If in front of a parking meter, I blip out. Like I don't understand it. My wife would have to deal with it for me. And it's partly like Jeffrey Zeldin talks about this as well, like an interface blindness thing, I think, where as a designer, as an interface designer, um, I go into a different mode where I start to critique the interface rather than just trying to work it out. So if the interface is difficult to understand, then I immediately go into, well, I refuse to try and understand it now because I feel affronted by how badly designed it is. And I don't mean to do that. And I don't even consciously do that. I'm just like, well, this is wrong. And then I can't use it. And so yeah, the black and white thing is just like paring things down, making things visually easier for me to understand, and it's just very appealing to me. I'm a little bit colorblind, but only very slightly with greens and blues. And when I
Mm.
was a smoker, I'd always buy the wrong Rizzlers because you had your green Rizzlers and you had your blue Rizzlers, and yeah, I always got them mixed up. They just looked more or less the same to me. So yeah, I just like the anything which is super high contrast. Of course, from an accessibility point of view, you don't want literally black and white. People have told me that my videos are they're too high contrast. In some cases, you can get to that point where it's too high contrast, and it can actually for some people it looks as if the imagery is moving and not in the intended way. You
Wow.
get like a refraction thing, I think, where you can like the edges kind of start to. I mean, you can create this as a deliberate effect. So I've got like an effects processing bit of software which I use sometimes with my videos, where it's RGB shift, right, where it's kind of like it mismatches the color layers, and you can see like the red, the green, and the blue coming off to the side. But I think that actually happens to people automatically sometimes when they look at some of my content. So I am trying generally to kind of temper it down a bit. But I personally really like things which are just like really, really high definition. And black and white is as high, as high contrast as you can get, isn't it? So
It is.
yeah.
I adore it, and if anyone hasn't sort of seen your videos up until now, then definitely implore them to go and seek them out. And I do need to just mention a very quick point, because when you mentioned slightly colorblind with the greens and blues, my wife would tell you the exact same thing about me, because I was
Mm.
convinced for years she had green eyes. So when anyone
Oh
would ask,
wow.
well, what color are her eyes? I would always say green, and she thought I'd
But that
never
which makes
actually.
you look terrible. Yeah.
Yep, never paid attention. So now we've settled with teal. Her engagement ring has
Oh,
a teal
okay.
um,
Yeah.
stone in the middle, and it's now my favourite colour, because I can just say it's a greeny blue and get it right somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had conversations. I not so long ago I had a conversation with my mum, which was interminable. It turned into this really heated debate about the color of a set of curtains. We were in a pub and we were having a drink, and as we were drinking more, we were getting more and more like combative about the color of these curtains, and I was sort of coming at it from a standpoint of, well, I should know how color works because I'm a designer, and she was coming from a point of view as, yes, but you are colorblind a bit, aren't you? And I said, I don't know. Is it really with this kind of this kind of color or this kind of shade that it's a problem though? I'm not colorblind with it, and they just went on and on basically. Yeah, so we have those kinds of conversations sometimes.
Amazing. Right. Well, so back to it. I guess to dive in, as same with most or all of our episodes, love to learn a bit more about your journey, your background, and what led you to a career focused on inclusive design and in turn accessibility as well.
Yeah. So I'm perhaps a little bit unusual in that, well, so first of all, I didn't have a computer science background at all. I studied art when I was at school. Um, and then when I went to university, I did a course called digital media. And this is a long time ago. This is 2001. So we had 9/11, then I went to, that's what I remember, 9/11, then I was suddenly away from home and living in halls at university. I was doing this, I guess some people would perhaps pejoratively call it a bit of a Mickey Mouse degree, because it was sort of arty, but it was also digital. There was very little code though, is the thing. And I think that was kind of an interesting time then. You don't get that so much now, where if you were going to learn web design, you'd learn it as a designer. So you'd be someone who came from an art background, and um, and that was me really. And as I say, I'm quite unusual in that I actually did a course, and formally did it specifically. Um, and it was, it's things like learning Dreamweaver and all the Macromedia stuff. I did a lot of Flash stuff at the time,
Mm.
and yeah, and all of it was horribly inaccessible, of course. It was like pulling tables around, like visually in Dreamweaver's visual editor, you're like pulling table cells into positions that you want them. And then, of course, when you loaded that up into a real browser, they all moved and they were not in the place that you thought that they were going to be in. And it was, yeah, it was tough. But but yeah, there was very, very little code involved. So I remember my tutor at one point, I was like, I can't get this thing to work. And he opened up this separate window in, I guess it was Dreamweaver, where you could actually see the HTML code, and that was amazing to me. It was like, oh, he's actually gonna like hack it. He's gonna, like how I think it was an American senator. They thought you could like hack a website by going in DevTools or whatever and messing with the HTML code. I mean, that was me then. I knew so little about programming. It was so alien to me that I was like, oh, this is really like crossing into a different territory if you're actually working with the code. And then when I left university, uh, somehow or other, I got into web design, and it just became a question of sort of professionalism. Like, I need to know how this stuff works underneath. So I learned to code. I learned to code HTML and CSS. JavaScript wasn't even really on my radar then. When I was eventually introduced to jQuery, I thought jQuery was an alternative to JavaScript, rather than being just like some library that someone built with JavaScript. I write a lot of JavaScript now, but I'm very much well, at the time, I called myself a technical designer, I suppose, like some sort of job title, which was to say, I I am a designer, but like I get some of this code stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Um, Now I think most people think of me as a developer, which is kind of frustrating in a way, because uh, I'm yeah, I do a lot of front end development, but I think of myself as a designer first, I suppose, and that the code is a tool for design, rather than a profession in and of itself. Um, yeah, and so the accessibility element, or the inclusive design element, is, I guess this probably happens with quite a few people, where you're just not really aware of it, because unfortunately, especially back then, going back 10 or 15 years, it wasn't really something that people talked about. It was even more so like a more of a kind of a considered, quite wrongly, as a sort of a niche thing, or an optional extra thing, and it
Yeah.
just wasn't talked about in kind of like everyday development or design discussions. And I think I remember the kind of that kind of epiphany moment was when, I think I was dealing with some library like jQuery UI, if you remember that, or something like that. And they had, responsibly, with their kind of modals, I think they were pushing the focus ring onto the button when the modal opened, so that you could see where your focus was. And to me, that just seemed like, why would you? That looks ugly. Why would you put that there? That looks like an error. I didn't know what it was, but then as soon as I, I I worked out what that was for, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So if it wasn't for that, then there's certain people that can't use this. And then once that door opens, I suppose, then you start thinking about that a lot more, and you think, well, if these people need things like this, there must be other people that need other kind of accommodations, if you want, uh, to use things. And then that just became really interesting to me. I think I got really interested in responsive design, because it's like, well, now you're making it work for more devices, and therefore it looks better and it's more usable for more people. And also, of course, like cross-browser design, or cross-browser implementation, I suppose. And and then accessibility was like, oh, there's another opportunity to do stuff well. I just wanted to do stuff well. I think a lot of people in my position was, you want to prove that you're good at your job, and actually doing things in an accessible way, is saying like, I know this stuff inside out, because I care about these people as well. And
Yeah.
um I think a lot of people frame it as kind of generously, as like a, oh, it must be because you like really care, and you're like, you care about these people and stuff. And of course I do, and I get very angry about injustices, and around people being marginalized and things like that. But it's actually really more like, oh, this makes my job more interesting now. There's more for me to think about, because I didn't want to become like a person who administrated databases, or go into that world, like the back end world. I wanted to stay in front end and stay in design, but I wanted more to sink my teeth into. And so accessibility gifted me with that, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. And it is, I guess it is that it's not to call accessibility or inclusive design an add-on, like a
Right.
lot of, but it's sort of an additional, I suppose, for you, in terms of like your role's already fulfilling, but it gives you that additional sort of purpose, I suppose, as well, more things to think
Purpose is
about,
the right
and yeah.
Purpose is the right word. Absolutely. Yeah. I've always identified, rightly or wrongly, quite heavily with what I do. Like I derive a lot of a sense of self-worth and purpose from my work. And so, yeah, the idea that there would be more to that, there was another dimension to that, made me feel like there was more to me, I suppose, by extension. So yeah.
Brilliant. And it's nice to have that sort of that viewpoint on it as well, because I think, like you've rightly mentioned, a lot of people, and I've probably given that title of, oh, you must be an empath, you're so empathetic
Mm,
towards people that's surely the only reason that you're in this space. And I guess that is probably, I'm projecting that on other people, because I like to think that I'm an empathetic person. So as soon as
mm.
I see a struggle, I'm like, what can I do to alleviate that? But yeah, no,
Mm.
it's a nice sort of different avenue, I suppose, as well, to sort of bring you into that world.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, the empathy thing is an interesting one because um obviously, like, empathy is a good in and of itself, right? If you're not able to see yourself in someone else's shoes, then that's a problem. I mean, that's sociopathy probably, but but you don't, like, professionally speaking. I think we emphasize empathy too much, perhaps in a professional sense. Like, you don't have to be empathetic. It's just a question of doing a good job, right? Like, that there's certain inputs and outputs. If certain people with certain inputs and certain outputs aren't getting what they need to get, then the product's broken.
Yeah,
So it's just literally a cold hard professional challenge. And I think, yeah, sometimes when it's framed as empathy, it's kind of dangerous territory as well, because the idea is that the idea that there are special people like you or I, in inverted commas, who who have this magical empathetic, like, talent or quality, it makes it easier for other people to go, oh well, I don't have that. Like, I don't have that like, it's almost like talking about it like it's telekinesis or something. Like, I don't have that magical power. Therefore, accessibility isn't for me. I'll leave that to those people who were, who were born to do this because of this
yeah.
special thing that they have. Yeah. Um,
Superpower. I think it's that's really nail on the head for me in a certain aspect of my role as a recruiter, because
mm,
you can't search for empathetic people. Like, that's not
no,
something that
right.
you're going to put on your CV. You're not going to go, oh, I'm such an empath. So um,
Yeah.
actually, if you're hiring for someone that works in accessibility, then empathy shouldn't actually be on that job list. I know there's an awful lot of things on job descriptions within the space that probably shouldn't be on there as well, asking for a bit too much. But I think,
True,
yeah, it's
true.
not one I'll be adding.
Yeah, I think, I mean, everyone, if you're hiring anyone who's incapable of empathy into any role, yeah, it's probably doing yourself a disservice, aren't you? So, yeah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's actually
Nice.
that in terms of recruiting, or like trying to quantify what someone should have to be good at accessibility. Yeah, on one end of the spectrum, sort of very broad and kind of wishy-washy ideas like that are not particularly helpful. But also, I wouldn't say it was especially helpful if someone, like, knew, like, ARIA inside out or something like that. Like, it's obviously a useful thing to be aware of and to know how to apply correctly. But you can also get so much done without it, and actually having the wisdom to avoid using it is another. I think I can imagine a recruiter saying, well, you must know this very specific version of ARIA. You need to know all of the different attributes, all of the roles, all of the and it being like, well, yeah, I don't tend to use those. And then going, well, that sounds bad, because they would think, I mean, I've encountered people like this, you probably have as well. If you're not using ARIA, then it's not accessible. Like,
Yeah.
and it doesn't work like that. So, yeah, I honestly, I'm not sure what I would be looking for. I think just generally just a willingness to learn, and being a good advocate generally, um, being
Yeah.
able to actually get other people excited about making things work in that way, I guess.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because one of my jokes to kind of break the ice or break the tension before people go in for interviews with some of my clients is, if they say, oh, what kind of questions are they going to ask me? I'll just say, well, as long as you can recite WCAG 2.2, all of the success
Yeah,
criteria in verbatim, then you're fine.
yeah.
But yeah, no, it's, yeah, bit broader, but perfect.
Yeah.
So, the next question is about the book inclusive components. Nearly gave it
Mm,
the wrong title. Um, it has been influential in guiding developers towards creating accessible web interfaces. So I guess, again, could you share a bit more about the inspiration behind that project, sort of putting pen to paper? I know that you are an author and technical writer. And your sort
Yeah.
of, how did you envisage that, that impact on web accessibility practices in the future?
Yeah. So I wrote I approached Smashing Magazine a while ago. I'd written a few articles for Smashing Magazine. One my favorite thing to do is write, I suppose. When it comes down to it, I really like writing, and it's the best way to learn as well. So a lot of the stuff I've written, I was learning it as I was writing it. I think some people think that when they read my books, that like I'm drawing from this huge well of experience or whatever. And whilst I do have a lot of experience in this industry, if you can call it that, uh, I've been doing it for 20 odd years. When I'm writing, it's the purpose of writing is to get my own head around things, and so I got into writing. I contacted Smash Magazine, did a few articles with them. They were very good to me. They have really good editors. Um, there was an editor called Francisco who helped me with my first article and really kind of held my hand, like this is the kind of thing we expect, and walked me through it and everything. And then I just got really into that. But then I got interested in the accessibility side of things, and I thought, oh, I think we need something which talks about accessibility, but talks about accessibility in the context of kind of more complex kind of interfaces and applications that were emerging at the time. So this was around the time that we started to get things like single page applications, and um, people were using JavaScript a lot more heavily, and things were a lot more interactive. And it was like at the most basic level, I wanted to shout from the rooftops to people who were saying, if it's running JavaScript, it's not accessible. Like that kind of way of seeing things. Like we need to do a separate site that isn't interactive in the same way. It's like, no, 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 no. Like screen readers actually can, like, they interact in the same way, and you get state updates and things like that. And that's all been in the spec for a while. And so I wanted to, yeah, write something about that. So I approached them and said, what if I do a book for you? And it became this book called Apps for All. And it's really ancient now, but some of it's probably still relevant. But also, I've basically rewritten that book 2 or 3 times, so that's like my first stab at it. And so I did that one first. It was quite short. It was probably only 20,000 words or something like that. And then later, I did one called Inclusive Design Patterns, and that was more high level, I suppose. So it was looking at it was it was talking about code fairly frequently, but it was also about things like readability, so like things intersecting with cognitive accessibility and that kind of
Mm.
stuff as well, and just general usability and how that crosses over into accessibility. And I was proud of that one because that was my first book that was actually put into hardback. They actually did a print run of it, and I did all the illustrations in it as well. And looking back, the illustrations look crazy. Like
Mhm.
they're the weirdest. Like I don't know where my head was at when I made those, but it has like little cartoons throughout it with little jokes about stuff, um, which I decided was a good idea for some reason at the time.
Well, it
But
appeals to someone like me that can't read a book without pictures in it. So,
yeah, it's got plenty of pictures in, yeah, for sure. But but then on the back of that, I still wanted to write more, but I wanted to do it kind of like more as a website, because the whole process of writing a book is very involved, of course, and then you get to a point where you release the book and you realize there's loads of, well, not loads, but there's typos, and there's things which then go out of date and all of that stuff. And so just having a website where each article is like a chapter, felt like a good idea. So that was inclusive components to begin with. Was just it was a blog, but the idea was that it was kind of like building a design system, and every chapter or every article, every blog post would be a component in that design system. And I started this and I kind of announced it. I remember I was in Toronto, so I was hanging out with the kind of accessibility crew there. It was the Ali Toronto, Ali TO, or Ali 2 is what I
Yeah.
call it, I guess, conference. So I spoke at that conference, hung out in Toronto, and yeah, and that's when I started that. And everyone was really nice and really supportive about it. I'm really excited about it. I think, yeah, the first chapter was about buttons, but the idea with it was that I think, unfortunately, a lot of the advice that people get around accessibility is uh, it's kind of from the point of view that there's a right or wrong way of doing it. And so, for example, I mean, I have clients all the time who I have to kind of take them to one side and explain this to them. Like the area practices guidelines, APG, it's sort of seen as gospel, like this is absolutely what you must do. And even APG, I think somewhere in the in its own documentation, it says like these exemplify ways you can incorporate ARIA, and the the implication is that there are other ways of doing it, and also you don't have to do it, like you don't have to create the patterns. That you can create different patterns, or you can create the same pattern, perhaps rely less on ARIA to achieve it, etc., etc. um and so I wanted to do a in I wanted this to be about my thought process rather than me coming down from on high and saying I'm an accessibility expert, this is how you must do things. Just like, well, this is how I think about this. I'm going to say that this feels right. Let's do it this way, and just explore it in as much detail as I could. And I think in the introduction to the book I say something along those lines about like, you will probably find better ways to create these components. This is as good as I could do at the time of writing. And I was thinking about it as deeply as I could,
Mm.
and trying to think of all of there's always more people and more like failure points that you can think of course. And I've had some really nice conversations with people since, where they've approached me and said, I learned a lot from that chapter on cards or whatever. What if I did this? And I'm like, well, yeah, I think you should. Like, I wish I'd thought of that. I would have put it in there. Um, and yeah, and then the book just came about because uh, I just thought it'd be nice to have like it all tied up as a product. And uh, it was an excuse to have like an extra chapter, which is on dialogues. Now, this chapter is quite out of date because it talks about using what are the native there's the native thing for creating modals with JavaScript. I've actually forgotten what they're called now. I haven't used one for such a long time because dialogue is now actually an element, which is a thing which is actually well supported. But I talk about that basically. That's kind of like the book only chapter is about using those methods basically.
Right.
Um, and I'm thinking about probably rewriting some of that stuff, bringing it up to date, I guess, because it's getting a little bit out of date now. People still refer to it a lot, apparently, which is great, but I'm starting to worry that there's bits in there which could, they could be considered a bit out of date now. So yeah, look forward to version 2 when I find the time to do that. Yeah.
I guess that's goes back to your point on the risk of putting it in print, because with a website it can be updated slightly,
Exactly.
and then you've not got examples of that sort of just sitting there. I know there's ways to find archived websites, but when it's in print, it's like that's. I mean, it's right for the time, and I think it's a great thing
Yeah.
to do, and yeah, maybe that's a bit of a disclaimer on there. Like, remember
Yeah.
this was written in 2022 or whatever it was, but yeah.
Well, it was yeah, sometime before that actually.
All right, yeah.
It's quite an old book now. Yeah, yeah. It's yeah, it was sometime before the pandemic. I would say probably 2016, 2017 even.
Amazing. Wow.
Um Yeah, so I do think it still stands up as kind of an exercise in what I like to think is that you could read it now, and the specifics, some of it will be a little dated, um, but the exercise of getting into the mindset of thinking inclusively, like how would I approach this when I'm thinking about it, uh, when I'm thinking about trying to solve those kinds of problems, then hopefully it's kind of more helpful from that point of view. So then someone would walk away and they'd learn how to approach design in that way. They do it differently because they'd have things, um, uh, more things available to them, like the native dialogue element and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Amazing. And this is really fascinating me because an episode that we recorded recently was with Jonathan Hassel, and he was talking about the
Mm.
strategy and the international sort of standards, and from that sort of side of things. And I love that this is more on the sort of it's still got the elements of that strategy and the way to think about things, but it's more on the practical implementation side of things, I suppose. Is that where you would say that that's where your background is, that's where your expertise sort of lies, is on the practical doing rather than the strategy and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, bit of both. I mean, when when design systems come into play, it's always a bit, the strategy part is always a big part of it. Um, I suppose you could say my strategy, if I'm working with an organization to try and improve their accessibility, is to be hands-on, but hands-on with a team of people. So I would normally be embedded with a team, usually a front end team or a design systems team. And it's really just like the thing that I think works the best in these situations, or has worked really well on a couple of occasions, is where I just work as a member of the team for a while, but I just happen to be that person who has a bit more experience in accessibility. So I'm on Slack and people will go, "Oh, you know that thing we were working on? What do you reckon about this accessibility aspect to it?" And then
Mm.
I'd be able to draw upon a bit more experience in that. But just generally just working with those people, and then over time, hopefully just getting them excited about it. Like, oh, like we did this thing with this component. Well, turns out that some of the people in the inclusive testing that we did, they were really excited about it. They found it much more usable, and then that kind of the ball keeps rolling. Then, if you see what I
Yeah.
mean. Like I wrote up, I don't know if you saw them, but I wrote up some uh, accessible design principles recently, which I put on GitHub, and it's just a set of like much higher level principles. So it's not like a strategy. How do you deal with an organization? How do you get them to care about accessibility thing? And it's not like a this is where you put your ARIA attribute thing. It's somewhere in the middle where it's like, as a designer and a developer, and I'm both, and I think a lot of people involved in accessibility, one way or another, are both. How do you, from a high level, how do you approach getting the technical stuff done? And one of the principles is around how, if you just go into an organization or you just work at an organization as an employee, and you just take on the accessibility role yourself and you do it in isolation, then if you leave or you're moved on to something else, then that work will quickly fade. People will undo it because they won't be able to appreciate the benefit of it. It will disappear, or it just won't get taken any further. And so you do need to try and bring other people on board. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, really, but like it really is that important that you need to get people uh, to kind of work with you on it, if you sort of mean, or,
Yeah.
or even just like delegate, say like, this is how I would do this. Why don't you go about that in this way? See how it feels. See how you get on, or just sort of try and empower people to, because folks are weirdly really uh, nervous or um,
Apprehensive.
yeah, apprehensive about taking on accessibility because they're made to feel like it has to be done just right. Otherwise, you are you are ruining the lives of already vulnerable people, which, you know, if you can be, but you're more likely to be doing that by not caring at all, or by doing whatever's going on in the US at the moment, which is to deliberately dismantle all of that stuff, which is crazy as well. But and that's another thing that I put into those into the principles, is this idea that nothing's 100% accessible. Don't be don't run away from just trying to do your best with it. Like there's so much pressure that people feel about like getting, no, I won't do it because I'm not best suited to do this. I think someone else who's more of an expert should do it. No, just do what you can. You know, some of it, do, if you make it a bit better, it's a bit better. It doesn't, nothing's 100% accessible. It's never going to become 100% accessible. Nothing I've ever done is 100% accessible. It's important that folks just take a bit on. And it's sad that we have this thing where yeah, folks are scared to make it their responsibility, because then they feel like they're holding a lot on their shoulders by doing that.
Yeah.
But if everyone's doing that, then no one's doing it at all. So yeah.
It feeds into a lot of the imposter, I was going to say syndrome, but I guess imposter phenomenon that we see a lot within accessibility in that community as well, because it is that element of, oh my God, I've chosen to, take this on and I really want to make things better, but
Yeah.
sometimes I can't actually do that, and sometimes it's just not possible. But your
Yeah.
heart's in the right place, and you're trying to do. But I love that as well as a strategy, if you could call it a strategy, is the embedded approach. I think, like you said, you've got an expert within a team that can play on both those strengths of design and development. It's something that I've been trying to pitch to a lot of clients and say, look, even if you have one person in this team for 6 months to a year as a contractor, they can work on various different projects, but they also come equipped with this knowledge, this additional knowledge that people in your teams may not have right now. And I think that that's a good way to approach it, sort of build the maturity from the inside out sort of thing, rather than just slapping a big sort of overarching strategy.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, exactly. It sounds like that's kind of worked for you as well then. Yeah. Yeah, when it gets too abstract like this, when if someone were to ask me like, we need you to like change the culture in our organization so that accessibility is a thing, like that's a very difficult thing to do. And I organizations where they haven't been able to instill any kind of culture around that, I suspect they never will. If you sort of mean, like, it's usually it's more a case with these larger organizations are generally aware that it's something that needs to be done. They just don't quite know how to go about it. And I think just being hands on and saying, look, you can just do this is like is a good approach. Yeah, just sort of leading by example, or just, yeah, getting your hands dirty basically.
Yeah.
Because usually there are people who, well, it's something in my experience anyway, what's been really lovely is that folks are really happy for me to be there because
Yeah.
it's like, I have all of these questions that I want to ask about accessibility because I already care about it. It's not like you're coming in and going, right, this is what accessibility is.
Yeah.
That's very rarely the case, I find. Usually it's not the developers or the designers which are failing at accessibility. It's the organization from a higher level that's failing at it. But then when you're when you're kind of trying to attack the organization itself and trying to reform that, it doesn't work that way. You have to, it's like it has to be like a groundswell,
Yeah.
yeah, to some extent, like a grassroots type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I know I've asked many questions that I hadn't sent you beforehand, but I'm really loving the chat. So sorry about
Yeah,
that
likewise.
for
Yeah.
catching you off guard. But
No, that's fine.
amazing. Right. So the next question I did sort of send over was about sort of, I guess, the perceived tension between creating visually appealing or beautiful designs, as some people
Mm,
might mention them, and ensuring accessibility. So do you
mm.
think that there's is there a cheat code, I suppose, to balancing aesthetics with functionality to achieve designs that are both beautiful and accessible? Or, yeah, is there any sort of fundamentals that you can maybe share that? Or
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I think personally, I think that accessible it equals beautiful. I think from my
Yeah,
own
well, that would have
perception,
been
but
the first thing. Yeah, yeah, we totally agree on that. Absolutely. In terms of contrast, obviously, make everything you do black and white, no exceptions. What I do, but not actual black and white because that will make people see colors, kind of paradoxically. Um, but yeah, I think that whole the idea of an interface being the site of some sort of aestheticism is a really weird thing, and I don't quite know how we got into sort of thinking of things like that. An interface is something to be used, right? It has a purpose. It's not something to be admired, um, or kind of yeah. I that whole thing of where you have an argument with a visual designer who really wants to do like a low contrast thing, and the classic thing is like a really thin font, like a really delicate font, um, and it's in a very light gray, so it's barely you can barely see it, um, and the thing is that doesn't look good either. So the argument is but it needs to look good. Well, A, it doesn't because it's an interface. It needs to be usable. That's the priority. I mean, I'm like a insufferable utilitarian. Like I have very little room for aesthetics in interface design anyway. But um, yeah, the idea of that looking better, I find really weird anyway, because I just think that kind of um, hesitant kind of unconfident design, if you like. That's what I get from it. Is you don't you're seeing these kind of like uh faded or unassuming sort of things. It's no, I want it to have more confidence. I want it to be bold. Um like literally but figuratively bold.
Mm.
And I think yeah, I think it's actually a sign of a designer who isn't that confident in their work when they start to incorporate elements like that. And so that but it part of this the problem, and I've talked about this a lot recently, it's something that preoccupies me a lot, being somebody sort of between developer and designer, is this idea where you have when you divide two roles very strictly down the middle between visual designer and then developer on the other side of the fence, like you create that binary. What One of the big problems that comes out of that is that then the person who's doing the visual design, who is relegated or is restricted to just making things look a certain way, will invest too much time and energy and thought into specifically how they should look, which
Mm.
actually isn't that important. But then they'll also second guess things. Do you know what I mean? Like the classic one is checkboxes.
Yeah.
They are understandable and usable, like from a cognitive point of view, because they are square and they will have a tick that will appear in them if they're checked, right? If you give someone a role where all they're in charge of is how things like look like borders, colors, shapes, nothing to do with like how things are written, how things are organized, how things work. If they're just focusing on that, then they will get bored and they will start messing with things, and they will take that square checkbox and they will make the corners round. And before you know it, you've got this weird hybrid between a checkbox and a radio. And then people don't know what they're doing. They look at it and they don't know what they're interacting with anymore. But that all comes from this weird division between development and design. And for us, design weirdly just meaning visual semblance and nothing else.
Mm.
So it's not really even a designer's fault. Their role is to and their way of kind of getting ahead in their career is to compete based on aesthetics because that's the only realm they're allowed to operate within. Um, Yeah, the more I think about it, the more angry it makes me.
Oops.
No, it's fine. I go off on one about that stuff very frequently anyway. So yeah, no, I think I've probably summarized it better than I have before. So it's good to have the opportunity to actually set it out in hopefully a useful way. Yeah.
Definitely. And it is interesting, isn't it? I think, would you say it's part of the nature of certain designers, or do you think it is because of previous expectation, like this is your role and this is what I'm used to focusing on, and a lot of portfolios will have mostly visual elements, so it's like, well, how can I present what I've created without showing you a visual sort of, rather than everything looking like the gov.uk website?
Yeah, exactly.
Because then
Yeah.
I guess you're trying to set yourself apart, but you can still do that and not just look like gov.uk. Brilliant website, not slating it, just saying.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah,
I mean, you could create a gov.uk type website where you take the whole design system as it is, but you could make it really kind of stand out and outrageous just by saying, say, like the links are in green and the font, like the heading font is has like rough edges, or or you just have a different palette, like a good contrast palette, but a different. You could
yeah.
change just a few things about the gov.uk website and it would look entirely different, right? And it would really set itself apart. And so yeah, I don't know. There's so many different combinations of color. Just talking about color on its own, there's like a near infinite combinations of color, which means because of the way Infinity works, there's also a near infinite combinations of accessible color choices. So you've got a lot to work with. Like you're
Yeah.
not. I mean, there's a lot to be said for things looking kind of conventional because then they're easier understood. But like just swapping out a specific color or a font or whatever, as long as the font's still legible, it's immediately going to look so different. I mean, one of the things I care about most in web design is typography, and you don't even need to have like a body font that is particularly unusual. You can just go with Georgia. It's if you have your heading font as something which is kind of a bit more outrageous or a bit more jaunty and weird, as long as it's still legible, then you don't even notice the body font, right? Like that on it, like a statement like that can really transform um, how people perceive the site, just like one font choice in one place. So it's actually so easy to make an original looking website, but you need to make bold choices is the important thing. Like try
Yeah.
not to like fade everything out and make everything too subtle or too small, because then it starts to get inaccessible and visually ugly at the same time.
And just irritating, I think, as well.
Yeah,
I think yeah, you and I both get quite irritated, I think, when we're seeing certain things like that, and just know it can be better.
yeah. Oh, and also,
But
yeah, since we're on the subject, underline your links as well. Like that's a classic. Sorry, I'm going off on one again,
no, it's good.
but there's a classic one where designers are taking away something which is so important to how, like, hyperlinks are literally what the web is for. I mean, we've got loads of JavaScript doing all sorts of weird interactions and tracking us and dobbing us into the CIA or whatever now. But links, just pages linked together, is the still the most important part of it. And someone made it trendy at some point a long time ago to remove the underlines, that was how we knew which parts of the text were links. Like you can't really overstate how important that is in terms of usability. And yet all of the big organizations, I think GitHub do this, Amazon do this, like every day I see a huge well-known organization's website where they're only differentiating the text with a color and without the underline.
Yeah.
And that's ugly, first of all, because then it's just like, well, I'm just reading normal text, but then weirdly this bit of text is in a different color. To me, it makes more sense. It looks nicer if the link text is in the same color as the surrounding text, but it has an underline.
Yeah.
But they went the other way. So I mean, I don't understand. But then like I like black and white. So, but yeah, I don't. But that just one of those things where that just became a thing. People started doing it, and it's so bad. It's such a fundamental error in our thinking and the way that we present web interfaces. But it's just so ubiquitous. And yeah, I mean, I created a t-shirt a long time ago, or I had a slide in a conference talk, which became a t-shirt that someone else created, and now I'm selling my own version of it. But it just says "underline your links, you sociopaths" on it. And it's like, it's one of those things where am I taking crazy pills? Like, why are people still doing this? It's such an easy thing not to get wrong. But there you go. Yeah.
And it's almost more effort to take the underline away, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
If you're
yeah, exactly.
hyperlinking text, does it not usually, is it not an automatic thing that
Yeah,
happens?
yeah, absolutely. It is. You could do no CSS. You could publish your site in Times New Roman,
Yeah.
and then you'd have nice margins. First of all, decent font size, good leading, and all of that. Not so good measure. You might want to
Mm.
bring that in. But yeah, you get them the user agent style sheet takes care of that for you, which is your first clue that you probably want to leave, that they should probably be there. But the justification is always, oh, it's clutter. And they speak for users. They say, oh, users don't like them.
Mm.
Like, really? Did you have users? Do you have multiple users in a study say, I don't want to see underlines on links. I don't want to be able
Mm.
to tell what's a link and what's not. That's not useful to me. It's
How
ugly to see
yeah. How many of those users were the one person that's making that decision? It's like 100% of users that were asked, and that's the one user that's making the decision.
Well, I mean, that's a big problem as well. Like especially in research around accessibility. I did a talk about this recently called "The Folly of Chasing Demographics," and it's about how it's this idea that if you speak to one screen reader user, then they somehow represent all screen reader users. So you only have to get one screen reader user into your usability study, right?
Right.
And it's like, and whatever they say goes. But then, like, believe it or not, they have different opinions about things, and they use screen readers for different reasons, in different circumstances, in different ways, at different times, and
Yeah.
like. But it's that kind of very patronizing thing of like, well, I spoke to a blind person, and so therefore, I now understand how what blind people want. We don't do that with other users. We generate all sorts of superfluous personas for them, don't we?
Cool. Well, I've got another question
Mm,
on your sort of work and working with different incredible companies that were mentioned earlier in the podcast, and how they sort of do things differently. Because we don't all do things the same way. Some industries are very different from others. But
mm,
you've probably had a great insight into those different approaches.
mm.
So I guess, could you sort of let us know of any sort of lessons that you've learned from how you may have had to change tact or shape your approach to promoting accessibility within sort of different organizations or industries?
Yeah. So, I I mean, we've covered this a little bit already. Like the kind of um, the best approach generally, I think, is to be like hands-on, be embedded, and just work on what people are working on
Mm.
alongside them, but just be that person who's on hand for more of the accessibility related uh, stuff. How different organizations compare? I mean, generally, I would say that it's fairly uniform. Like most organizations have the same kinds of problems, especially when you get to a certain kind of scale. And when organizations get to that scale, it's no longer it's just a momentum issue, right? It's just a kind of a changing course or changing the way that they do things, changing their practice. It just takes more time, and that's that's why design systems are very difficult. But I suppose one thing which is a very marked difference between different organizations is the specific technologies they use for their design systems. And so without naming these two organizations, because I probably shouldn't, but organization A, they had a design system which was based around React and TypeScript, and organization B had a design system which is based around just web standards, vanilla JavaScript. I mean, reasonably like coded up into its own sort of like modules and things like that, but but like not tied to a specific framework. And it is much harder for me to do my job as someone who's trying to kind of reform or to improve a design or design system or any or whatever products it might be, when they're using a very specific and very opinionated technology, especially when it has a very complex build process as well. So I'm very much a vanilla JavaScript, vanilla CSS, vanilla, and no one says vanilla HTML, do they? It's just HTML. But I mean, I suppose vanilla
You could start saying
HTML
it now.
is, yeah, yeah. I'll do a t-shirt.
I was going to say, I'm imagining an ice cream cone with HTML coming out of it now.
Yeah,
So.
of course. Yeah, standard, job done. But yeah, I find it really frustrating working with those things. Like they really, to me, like very over-engineered environments for doing anything. And so like one of the really frustrating things is if I'm working on a component which uses TypeScript, and I know that I need to add, in this case, and it's not always the case, obviously, in this case, it would benefit from having an ARIA attribute of some form in it. Now, to me, as someone who's been doing HTML for 20 years, an attribute is just an attribute, right? There's nothing computer sciencey about it. It's just you write it on, and in the quotation mark part, that's the value, but it's a string. It's always a string. I mean, even if it's like ARIA hidden equals true, that's not a Boolean. That's just the word true, right? I mean, it sort of is in terms of the HTML specification, but it doesn't need to be typified in a way that JavaScript engineers seem to think it needs to be typified, which is why they built these monolithic systems for typing around it. Now, I can kind of appreciate wanting to use a type system like TypeScript or something like that for your kind of like your underlying JavaScript functions, modules, whatever they are. But this stuff has been brought in much more into the front of the front end. And that's a problem because it's slowing down people who don't specialize in that kind of computer sciencey kind of Java-like approach to doing things. And so in a simple system, organization B, well, I say simple system, is still a large design system for a multi-product organization. But because it's written in plain Java, I think it was written just using handlebars as a way to compile stuff, but then we're adding a little bit of JavaScript on top, like plain JavaScript. I can just go in there and put an attribute. I can put ARIA hidden equals true on there, do a PR, and it's done.
Yeah.
With the TypeScript system, there's also like I'm breaking all sorts of tests which don't need to be there, which were pulled in from some sort of automated AI driven test suite thing or whatever. And then I've got to tell, and I don't know how to write TypeScript, or I didn't at the time. I've got to then tell it that it's this type of value that's needed. So I have to write a type definition in a separate typed file and all. I mean, it's more work, first of all, but it's also, it's a steep learning curve to need to know those very, very opinionated, very specific ways of doing things. When I and everyone, to some extent, should be familiar with plain JavaScript and plain CSS and those kinds of things. So I think it's a lot to expect people who ultimately, as we touched on earlier, come from a design or an art background to get into this very, very strict, very kind of computer science based way, like software engineering way of doing things, and it really holds stuff up. So in an organization like the one which has those kinds of things in place, then I find myself battling them, and then it becomes more of a conversation about, you are alienating people who have my kind of expertise. This is going to be a problem for you. Like the kind of people who are comfortable in that environment come from a back end kind of school of thought, and that's not in most cases a school of thought which is where interfaces per se, let alone accessible interfaces, even come into the education or anything. So you're kind of you're railroading yourself into this situation where you are inevitably going to be employing people who will not know how to do this stuff, because the environment is for a different kind of developer. So then it becomes like, that's actually, it's not an accessibility problem as such. It's more of a hiring and culture problem in a much bigger way. I mean, I worked for one organization where I was supposed to be, I've told this story a couple of times before, but I was supposed to be working on the accessibility of the design system specifically. And instead, as it turns out, despite the fact that they had a very large team of developers and a large team of designers, no one knew Flexbox. Like, no one, this was an established way, like the sort of de facto main way to do layout at the time. So it wasn't that long ago. And no one understood how to make basic Flex-based layouts. They were really struggling with their responsive design. So instead of working on the accessibility, I ended up working on just helping them build out their components from a layout point of view. And then a month into this contract, the higher ups who got me involved, they're like, well, show us where we've got in terms of accessibility. What are the improvements? And it's like, well, we haven't really done much, because we're literally just struggling to get this out at all. Like, everything I was making as accessible as possible as I was making it, but I wasn't addressing accessibility specifically, because they had such a deficit of knowledge in terms of the front end in general. Wow. that they were like, oh, this person actually knows, like, the front of the front end. We just need him for all of that. So I was split between all of these different things. And that's with with loads of developers there, and really talented, really intelligent people, but people who, as I say, they're not their kind of, their background isn't in knowing interfaces. They're like, where this stuff actually meets the user. It's much more the underlying engineering kind of guts of it. And so much of the front end now is actually not the front end. It's the guts of the back end just shoved into the browser or shoved into, at least into the workflow of what is nominally front end work. And that's a big problem. But yeah, the other organization, they had to fight for it, because they had a very big, very influential, I suppose you could say, engineering team, which were much more back end oriented. But there was this kind of breakout group of people who were much more, who really saw the benefit in making the front end be front end. And and that meant that I could just get involved and I could work with that stuff, and I could actually make things happen. I could actually do my job.
That's good.
Yeah.
There's a slight irony there as well, I suppose, because I think the misconception maybe is that if you're implementing JavaScript frameworks like React, like, um, Angular and things like that, you think, oh, well, it's all sort of there to be used. So you just sort of ingest it all, and then you can sort of pick and choose within that framework, and it'll save you time. But actually, it's come full circle to say,
I mean,
well, actually, you're going to be spending an awful lot more time on trying to figure these things out to make any amendments.
I really think it is that. I think the whole idea of it being a time saver is almost gaslighting from the outset with stuff like that. Because what does like React actually do for you? Well, what it does is it gives you the privilege of being able to create stuff with React. It doesn't actually create your application or your website for you. It just like enables you to do it with React, and then you've got to learn React. So if you know JavaScript already, then you might as well do that, and then you're not dealing with this this very specific and very complex environment. Because I mean, if it's like 200 kilobytes out of the box and that's just hello world, then where does that leave you? Especially when it's like literally not allowing you to do anything else. There's nothing in that React can do that JavaScript can't do already. So
Yeah.
I don't even find it any more ergonomic. Like I find it easier to read plain JavaScript than to delve through like JSX and stuff like that. I mean, that might just be me. But yeah, I think that it had a lot of promises, and I don't know if I think a lot of them were kind of very hollow, basically.
No. Maybe it's added a bit more nuance than it's meant to. It's sort of,
well, certainly
complexity.
with complexity comes nuance, I suppose. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, no, thank you for that. Very insightful. And I guess
do my best.
so the final sort of question before final thoughts, and unfortunately the end of this episode, I just wanted to sort of ask around a key topic across the board within accessibility is burnout, and just wondering, you've been working mostly as a consultant and freelancer over the years, so how have you managed that? And then I guess maybe you slightly touched on it with the React and TypeScript side of things previously. But
if you want to burn out almost like within a second, then inherit a TypeScript based design system. Yeah.
But I mean, I guess. Sorry. Yeah.
No, you're fine. No, I was just gonna jump in. I mean, I'm definitely very susceptible to burnout, like a lot of people. I think anyone who cares about their work is liable to burn out at times, because it's really what you invest into your work that's what burns you out. Like if it was just a job to people, and it rarely is with accessibility, because people do really care about it. Burnout is always on the horizon, really. For me, it's been difficult in the past with, if I do a lot of auditing work, then I'm always in danger of burning out. I do actually like doing auditing work, as long as I'm not doing it like big blocks of it, like indefinitely, because it can really wear you down. And by auditing, in case anyone who's listening isn't aware of what I mean, but I mean essentially testing sites against WCAG for accessibility shortcomings, and then providing recommendations. And I do provide detailed recommendations and prototypes alongside it. And everyone who I've worked with, like I worked a lot with the Paciello group back in the day, and others. All of the people who I really respect in accessibility, if they're going to audit, they're not just telling you where you've gone wrong. They're telling you, and in great detail, this is how you should approach it better. I was careful not to say this is how you fix it, because it's not as simple as that. But this is what we'd recommend, and then provide code examples, all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, doing a lot of that work it can get very repetitive, and and so I like to try to mix that kind of work with stuff which is a bit more high level, inclusive design kind of work. So with the it's called TPGI now. I worked with I didn't work for them, but I worked with them as a contractor some time ago. They were very good at balancing the auditing services with inclusive design and accessible UX services. Like Sarah Horton and Henny Swan in particular, they were really big leaders in that. They really kind of like spearheaded that whole thing. Like, it's not just about making it work, it's also making it usable for people of different abilities. So it was a real pleasure to work with them on that stuff. And we drew up the inclusive design principles there as well. And so being able to do that, think about things at like at a much more of a removed level, is great. But I mean, personally, I'm interested in different aspects of the front end, and so kind of cleansing the palette, if you like, moving away from doing auditing work might mean doing some like visual design stuff, doing some animation stuff, or lately I've been doing a lot of work on and with the web audio API. So I'm a musician, and I'm really interested in music. With my videos, I actually soundtrack them all. I spend more time on the music than I do on the actual content or the animation.
Love
which
that.
is kind of which makes me realize that actually I should be focusing more on just doing music. Actually, interestingly to me, I've always found that show me someone who's like really into web accessibility, and there'll be someone who is either really into music, like heavily into music, or is heavily into music and is also a musician. I mean, a long time ago, I did this like charity uh accessibility album, where it was everyone who contributed a track to it. It was like a compilation, was someone who worked in accessibility or worked adjacent to accessibility. And there were some really cool tunes on there. Like, I discovered some really talented folks releasing some really interesting stuff, and it was like a real range of music as well. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
And
That's amazing. But I agree. I think I see a lot of creative sort of folk and a lot of musically inclined people within the web space as well. Definitely see a lot
yeah,
of that.
in general, yeah. And I know I'm kind of going to get on with someone if they care about accessibility and they're really into their music. And it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm into all sorts of different genres of music. It doesn't really matter what kind of music, unless it's reggae. I don't know why. I just don't really like
Oh,
reggae. It's the only one I don't really get on with. But I don't judge people for liking it themselves. I just don't listen to it.
I'll have to send you
But
some of the death metal tracks that I listen to and see how you get on with those. Maybe I can mix in some reggae with that.
I, I'm perfectly familiar with. I code frequently whilst listening to Napalm Death.
Oh,
I
brilliant.
love a bit of Napalm Death while I'm coding. Yeah. Who do you listen to, death metal wise?
Oh my word! I mean, some black metal as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Dimmu Borgir and
Oh, Dimmy
yeah,
Borgir. Yeah, some
yeah,
symphonic black
yeah.
metal stuff going
A
on.
bit
Yeah.
of that. Favorite
Nice.
bands, I would say, are Gojira and Lamb of
Mm,
God in the sort of general metal sort of space. But yeah, I've
yeah.
bit of an eclectic mix. Favorite band is actually The Cure. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Oh,
lucky
yeah.
enough to see them a few
What do you think of
times.
their recent album? They've
No,
just
I've
released one
enjoyed
recently.
it. Yeah, really
I
did
find it
like it. But
really dark
yeah,
and brooding. I mean, they kind of do that anyway, but like,
goes
but
with the goth side of
to a
things.
really heavy extent, I think. Yeah.
And then
Um,
apparently the follow up to that has got the saddest song that he's ever written on it. So it's like, well, how much sadder can he go?
yeah. I think they were trying to just like hit all of the extremes on that one record, maybe. But yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't heard all of it, but I've heard some of it and I really enjoyed it. And Gojira, if you're interested, I'll send you a link maybe. I did a mashup of a Gojira song with Mr. Bombastic, and it doesn't sound like it would work. Though I say so myself, I think it works quite well. I mean, it's weird, but I think it kind of works as a mashup. So yeah, I'll send you a link.
I would love to hear that, and I'll share that with. I'll probably just play it in the car with my wife's in there, and she'll probably be like, "I haven't heard this Gojira song," because she thinks they all sound the same. So.
Oh right, that's a bit harsh.
But yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I love. Yeah, we can definitely talk more music.
Yep.
Love that. But great. So other than that, Heydon, any final thoughts? Is there anything you want to share? Any upcoming sort of events that you're going to be going to? New roles maybe in the near future?
No, nothing at the moment. But I would ask folks to check out the accessible the accessibility principles. I've forgotten what I've actually named it. Hang on, I'll have a quick look on the GitHub. It's quite a prosaic name. The principles of web accessibility. Yeah. I've had it's been really nice the response I've got to it. So it's on my GitHub, and it's principles of web accessibility that should come up when you search for it. It's been translated now into French and into Spanish, and this Makoto, I met Makoto years ago in Toronto, so around the time that I was kicking off Inclusive Components. One of the warmest, funniest people I've ever met in my life, and he's written an issue up on this. It's called Japanese Translation. He says he's got 12 colleagues working on the translation, which is like, wow, that's amazing.
Oh my word.
I love it when stuff is translated into a lot of languages. My wife's Chinese, and she's offered to translate it into Chinese, and I think that'll be a bit of a flex to have something translated. Very little is obviously available in Chinese in terms of this kind of material, so I think that would be really cool. Yeah, so yeah, I would say check that out. And I'm on Mastodon. I'm on the frontend.social server, and yeah, I'm always up for just chatting about front end stuff and accessibility stuff. If anyone has ever read one of my books and thought, oh, I don't understand this, or something like that, then I'm always up for talking about it, because a lot of the time, it makes me rethink it, because as I said before, it's not all set in stone, and there's always a better way to do things, or more complete ways to do things. So it's always good to be talking about that kind of stuff. So
amazing. And I guess those complexities are going to keep popping up. There's always going to be something you might not have actually seen before, as much as unfortunately, a lot of the issues we see across the World Wide Web for accessibility are very similar. Like with the WebAIM million websites, it's always the same 5 issues that pop up. So, but yeah, I guess we can end on
underline links, you sociopaths. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have that on my gravestone, I think. Yeah. I can't believe we're still getting that wrong now, after all this time. It's so easy to not. So
just do that one thing. If anything, after listening to this episode, just do that. Just go through and just underline them.
Exactly.
And I'm sorry,
stop worrying about ARIA and all the complexities of that. Just underline them. Yeah.
I'm sorry I hadn't ordered a t-shirt before this episode, because I would have worn it proudly. But I'll be ordering one soon.
No obligation, obviously. There, I just think it's funny that that I get so worked up about it that I need to put it on a t-shirt.
Well, I'll link to that as well. So we'll have the link to your GitHub for the Principles of Web Accessibility for your t-shirt, and maybe if you've got anything for people to listen to in terms of your music as well, it'd be nice to link to that.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, of course.
Awesome. But thank you so much, Heydon. Really appreciate your time and everything you're doing.
Likewise, I really enjoyed our chat. It was good.